join later, that's fine as well. You don't need to listen to me. I want to give the most time to Camilla. So it's a pleasure to welcome Camilla Gilmore, who's Professor of Mathematical Education at the University of Loughborough in the Department of Mathematical Education. Even that in and of itself is very interesting. Her role in this interdisciplinary context has been leading psychologists to come together with educators now for many years. I know Camilla's used to start with her trajectory, which is an unusual one, into what she's doing now. But because she's very modest, I want to start off with what I think are my favorites of the many accomplishments. Camilla leads the ESRC Center for Early Mathematical Learning, but this brings together in excess of 20 different co-PIs.
Oh, yeah, 20 PIs.
20 PIs, 9 institutions. And you can see how this could be a big headache, but it isn't actually for Camilla as a scientist. I've so enjoyed working with her on the detail. She's absolutely interested in the experimental questions that we all love to answer, as well as the big picture. So absolutely the right leader for a center of that kind. Amazing. Oh, of course, she's received very many accolades. Again, my favorite, British Psychological Society Book Prize for a book that I would recommend. Anybody who wants to learn about mathematical cognition and education should read Camilla's book. And another one that is my favorite has actually been nominated as the Supervisor of the Year, the DPhil Supervisor of the Year for the Times Education Supplement. So really, going all the way from mentoring early career researchers to herding lots of colleagues into thinking about mathematical cognition. And I guess my third favorite is, while still being interested in cognitive psychology, working with educators and policymakers. So we'll hear a bit of all of that. And so it's such a welcome, such a pleasure to have you here to tell us about interference in number fact learning from lab to classroom. Welcome, Camilla.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak, and for that very nice introduction.
Oh, and I forgot to say Camilla was here as a PhD student.
And yeah, so I was asked to do a little bit at the beginning about my career trajectory. I think it links with your Athena Swan activities. So, okay, nothing.
Oh, no.
It's fine. I can use a space bar. No?
Oh.
Stopped again.
He spent a good 10 minutes working with it.
Well, I'll start talking about my career while I was trying to get this. So yes, I started off, I did my PhD here, well, not here, obviously, over there, where we were then. And actually 20 years ago, today, this year is when I finished, which feels incredible. Thank you. Then I went and did a postdoc. I went over to the States for a year to do a postdoc, which was a fantastic experience. But I decided I wanted to stay and have an academic career here in the UK, not over there. And then what I did was, so I was looking around for where to go after a postdoc. And the University of Nottingham had a new interdisciplinary research institute, the Learning Sciences Research Institute, and they had these kind of university fellowships. So I applied and I went there to do some interdisciplinary work with educators and computer scientists. Actually, they had quite an ed tech aspect to it. And then while I was there, I applied for external fellowships, and so got a British Academy Fellowship. And then basically I ended up being funded on fellowships from 2006 all the way through to 2022. So I've only very recently become a normal academic with a normal academic job. And one of the nice things about externally funded fellowships is that you can move them. So midway through that British Academy Fellowship, I moved to Loughborough, to the Department of Mathematics Education. And that was a bit of a step into the unknown because I was going basically to set up, to try and establish a mathematical cognition group there at Loughborough. And I've been there ever since, and it's been really, it's been fantastic. I've been promoted whilst I was there, whilst I was on fellowships, and they supported me to sort of progress, even though I wasn't yet on a normal academic role. And then we had two sort of big bits of funding. So in 2019, we got this funding from Research England called the Expanding Excellence in England scheme, where they take small groups, and there was only 4 of us mathematical cognition researchers, and they allow you to expand, and we've established the Centre for Mathematical Cognition, which was funded by Research England for a number of years and is now an existing sort of university research centre. And then, as Guy mentioned a couple of years ago, we had got funding from ESRC for the Centre for Early Mathematics Learning. And so that's now ongoing work. I wanted to also just point out in the theme swan. So I've done that. I've had 3 periods of maternity leave. So I've done the academic and 3 kids thing that hardly anyone does. And I've also worked part-time since 2008. I still work 0.8 now. So, it takes a lot of trust to kind of believe that actually you can keep going with this and that you can keep part-time going, and that actually not jumping for a permanent role sometimes works. Like, obviously I was lucky that my husband supported me being constantly on these kind of fixed-term contracts. But I just thought, it is possible to do it with a lot of luck along the way. And 2 other things I wanted to mention, as Guy has alluded to this a bit. So I absolutely consider myself to be a psychologist. I use psychology methods, I publish in psychology journals, I go to psychology conferences. But I actually haven't worked in the psychology department since 2006. And so you can be a psychologist anywhere, so don't be scared of kind of exploring different opportunities. And the value I get from the interdisciplinary work I do and working alongside in the same department with colleagues from different backgrounds is really, really valuable. And then the advice question mark thing is just I wanted to mention, when I left Nottingham and took my fellowship and I moved to Loughborough, lots of people told me it was a terrible decision and that I was going to ruin my career in doing it. And I haven't. And I think, I trusted that the people that I was going to work with, I believed in them and I believed in what we could do and that we could build something there. So I do think it's helpful to get lots of people's advice and to talk to lots of people about career decisions, but sometimes you've just got to go with your gut instinct, even if everybody tells you you're making a mistake. And maybe it could have been a disaster, but unfortunately it wasn't. Okay, so that's the kind of career overview bit. So it's brought me to this point, just to go back to, I'm going to talk about a project. This is actually not a project related to the Centre for Early Maths Learning. This is some work separately funded by the ESRC that has been a sort of ongoing project where I've been working with Lucy Cragg at the University of Nottingham. And we've got this long-standing interest in executive function skills and maths. And this particular project was about inhibitory control and multiplication fact learning. So I'm going to talk about a number of different, 3 different studies that are part of that piece of work. But I do always like to start talks, when I talk in psychology departments, doing a bit of a sales thing for maths as to why it's really important that as psychologists we should also look at maths development. I think it should get the same kind of attention as language development and reading development do. So we know that maths skills are really important. They're linked to long-term outcomes in terms of employment, well-being, quality of life. But we also know that lots of children don't develop the maths skills they need. And it's estimated that about half adults in the UK don't have the numeracy skills they need to kind of function in our very data-driven kind of society. And I think that the way to solve that, and because there's been attempts for decades to improve maths education, and I think what we're missing is a really good, solid understanding of mathematical cognition, those cognitive processes involved in maths learning. And we need that to develop the right kind of support and education approaches. And this project is focusing on multiplication fact learning. So why particularly this? Well, one reason is it's quite a cognitively complex task to learn and retrieve and use number facts. It's also got quite a well-established, although as I'll show you in a minute, quite an old sort of theoretical established framework for thinking about number fact learning. And so, when you've got that sort of theoretical basis in place, that gives you a good starting point of where to go with some experimental work. And it's also very educationally relevant. So anyone who's got children in primary school or has got anything to do with primary school children will know that there's this increasing focus on times tables. Times tables rock stars is something that most people have come across if you've got that kind of age children. And in fact, the government has introduced a few years ago the multiplication tables check, which is a statutory assessment of all children's multiplication fact knowledge that they take in year 4 when they're 8 to 9 years old. So it's a very politically kind of relevant topic, it's an educationally relevant topic, but I also think from a psychology point of view, it's a cognitively interesting topic as well. So I said that there was an established theory, so at the sort of start, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of that. And the first thing to say is that we know from some previous research that fluent recall of multiplication facts is associated with a success in mathematics achievement generally. But it's really important, I want to make sure you don't go away from here thinking that fact recall is the only thing that matters. It absolutely does not. Alongside it, children need to have good understanding of multiplicative reasoning. And I'm not going to be focusing massively on that in my talk, but that doesn't mean that I don't think it's important. I think it's absolutely just as important, probably more important than fact recall. But actually, here we're just focusing on fact recall. And as I said, that there's a lot of encouragement to focus on this by educators and policymakers. So there are some existing models of multiplication fact storage, and they come from like work in the 80s and 90s, where there was a big sort of thriving period of mathematical cognition kind of focused research that then just sort of dipped away. And the idea is that facts are stored in an associative network. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what I mean by this, so when children are learning their times tables facts, they're not learning them as an isolated fact, they're building a network where sort of 2 and 3 are associated with 6. And then you learn a new fact, and so now you're learning that 3 and 4 is associated with 12, and so on and so on. And so you're building up this network, and you can imagine how big and complex that gets. And how do we know this? Well, there is good sort of experimental evidence for this associative network. So if we kind of prime 3 and 4 and then ask participants to sort of name numbers very quickly, we see this priming effect that 12 would be primed. And this is a bidirectional priming. So the product primes the factors as well as the other way around. And so one consequence of this associative network is that if I want to retrieve the answer to 3 times 4, I've got to ignore these other associations. So I've built up this network of all these associations, and that could be really powerful for my kind of understanding of multiplicative reasoning. But when I'm trying to select a single fact, you've got to ignore some of these other kinds of associations. So one consequence of this kind of associative network is that we have this interference when we're trying to recall facts. And it's really, really evident. So if we look at the kinds of errors that people are making, really frequently, both adults and children make what we call neighbour errors. So if we look at the multiplication chart here, so if we've got 6 times 8 is 48, these numbers that are highlighted in yellow, these are what we call the neighbour errors. So they're kind of one step up and one step down from both of the multiplicants. And we see these kind of errors as production errors all the time. So this comes from about half of adults' errors from experimental paradigm with these kind of neighbour errors. And then we had the chance to do some analysis with some data, some anonymised data from times tables rockstars, and we had masses of data of the kind of errors that children were making. And we found that 70% of children's production errors are these kinds of neighbour errors. So they're not tending to recall just like a random answer, and neither do their errors look like they're calculating. It looks like they're trying to retrieve from their associative network, but they're getting interference from other facts that they know. And the assumption, and this is what's sort of suggested in the theoretical models, is that inhibitory control is needed to overcome this interference. But so far, most of the evidence just is correlational evidence. So we see a significant association between inhibitory control and measures of multiplication fact recall or addition fact recall as well. So that's kind of where we were when we went into this, this project. And we found there was lots of remaining questions. So questions about how do we build that associative network? How does interference develop? And also, how do we overcome that interference to successfully retrieve facts? And so I'm going to talk about 3 studies that try and answer some of those questions. Okay, So the main research questions that I'm going to be looking at is, first of all, like, how does interference develop over multiplication fact learning? Secondly, what is involved in overcoming this interference? And then thinking about, well, how can we alter that? Can we alter the role of this, or the way that these other associative facts interfere by the type of practice and activities that children are doing? And a little bit, I'll just touch on at the end about the link to multiplicative reasoning. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, 2 lab studies with adult participants and then 1 classroom study with children. Okay, so the first study. So the rationale for this study is that we've got these models of this associative network, but actually those models, they're written about sort of end state of what that looks like when you've learned it. And we don't really know much about the process of learning multiplication facts, or when, how this interference develops and emerges and what happens with it. So it's possible that as you learn facts that the level of interference stays the same, quite stable. It's possible that it might increase, or it's possible that it might increase first, and then as you continue to practice and consolidate your facts, then the interference decreases. But we don't know about this. And this is very difficult to study in children because we can't control what children are being exposed to. We can't measure their interference over the course of them learning some facts. So our study tracked the learning of 2-digit multiplication facts by adults, and we tested interference through the course of them learning it. So we picked facts that we didn't think they would know already, and our lovely participants came in across 2 days and learnt these set of 16 new multiplication facts. So this study, we had 50 adults. They were all undergraduate students, because you can get them and they'll do things like this for money. But they were all, none of them studying for a maths degree or a degree with lots of mathematical content to it. So we lots of psychologists. Obviously, you might say it's got lots of mathematical content, but I don't think they're not massively strong with their mathematics. And it was across 2 days. And so in total, they spent about 2 hours learning these facts. And we had 2 main tasks. So we kind of interleaved across the 2 days, the interference task, I'll describe the task to you in a minute, and these learning blocks. So we can track their learning of the facts, and we can track how the interference develops as they go across the learning session. And the study was all pre-registered. So what did the learning task look like? So we had these 16 new facts, and the first time we wanted to slightly replicate that idea of when, we don't think children should start by just rote learning facts. So we wanted the first time they saw each item, it was an untimed trial, and so they could use kind of procedural strategies to work out the answer. And then once they'd done that, then we had these repeated exposures at timed trials where they saw the fact, and they were asked to provide the answer, and then they were given feedback whether or not they were correct on what the correct answer was. And we did quite a lot of piloting to try and get a sense of how difficult or easy it was going to be for them to learn these facts. And so we ended up with this sort of increasing kind of target level of accuracy. So in the first session, they had to get 80% of them right at least once before they went on. And then for the later sessions, they had to get all of them right at least once. And so participants were doing different numbers of trials because some of them were having to go over these trials again and again. And at the end of each of these learning blocks, they went through all 16 and what we call in the test set. So we went through once more, so we've got a measure of accuracy at the end of that learning block where we're averaging across the same number of trials for each participant. Okay, so then the interference task. So in between these blocks, participants did an interference task that we're calling the number fact competition task. And it was a forced choice task. So they saw a problem, and then they saw 2 possible answers. And half of the trials, the incorrect answer was related to one of the other answers that they were looking to learn. So in case you can't work it out immediately, 18 times 18 is 324. And then the other half of the trials, the foil was unrelated. And we balanced very carefully. So each item didn't just have one related and unrelated foils, it had a number of them. And we balanced things like parity, and we balanced the distance from the correct answer and so on. So to try and make them as well balanced as possible. And essentially what we're looking for is a significant difference between these two types of trials. So if participants are significantly less accurate or slower on the related foil trials than the unrelated, then that's evidence of interference, because they're finding it harder to ignore that related foil answer. And in case you're wondering and saying, oh, but then the foils are more familiar in the related trials, we also did have these, at the beginning of each session, we had these familiarization tasks that was nothing to do with multiplication, where they saw all of those unrelated foils, so that the number of times they saw them over the whole session was balanced. So we're trying to make sure it wasn't just a familiarity effect. Okay, so going on to the results. So first of all, our pre-registered analyses. So what did learning look like? Well, everyone got better across all the blocks, but there was massive variation. So this graph, I'll give you a minute to look at it. So here, you can't really see, but the blue blocks are the learning blocks and the green blocks are the interference blocks. So we had 4 time points for learning. And this is individual participant data. And we were expecting there to be variation, but I don't think we were quite expecting that amount of variation, particularly on time 1, given that they were all undergraduate students at the same university of a fairly tight age range. So, you know, it's quite striking. I mean, one participant was completely accurate at the end of that first session and didn't have any more learning to do, whereas others are down at like less than 10%. So that's interesting questions about variation. I haven't got an answer to that, but that's something we want to go on and do. But we can see that there was also learning. So we did linear mixed models for all of the analyses here, and we can see that there's a significant effect of time, so participants are getting better across the time points. Okay, so then what about the interference? So now we're looking at the number fact competition task. So again, looking at the graph here, so we did see a significant interference effect. So here we've got 5 time points because they did the interference task 1 extra time. And the solid blocks are those unrelated trials, and the white circles are the related trials. So you can see that we have got this emergence of interference. This block here is before they'd done any learning, so they weren't actually at 50%, so they were a little bit better, they could do a bit of guessing, but there's no interference here, which is what we'd expect, and then it starts to emerge. And that's what the analysis suggests. So they're getting better, there's this consistent foil type main effect, but then there's also this interaction as well. So now you might be thinking, yeah, but there's obviously an interaction because the time 1 is there's no interference there because they haven't done any learning. So is the interaction just due to time 1? Well, no. So if we take away, where's the graph one? Yeah, if we take away that time 1, we still find an interaction. So it does seem like interference is increasing as they learn these items. And if we look at their production errors on the learning task, we see quite a high level of these interference errors there as well. So it's not as high as some of the children's data we'd have from the naturally occurring data, but still quite a significant proportion. Okay, so far, so that was our kind of pre-registered analyses. So now thinking about, we wanted to unpick this a little bit more and see what was going on. So far, we found that accuracy increases across the sessions from that learning data, and interference increases across sessions. So is it the case that actually interference is driven directly by the level of accuracy? Is it you only get interference once you've reached a certain level of accuracy? So what we did in this analysis, and I will talk you through this graph. So here we were looking at, instead of predicting interference by the time block, can we predict interference by their accuracy on the learning session they've just completed? So what we're looking at here is the accuracy from the learning block they've just done before the interference, And this is the accuracy on the number fact competition task, separately for the related and the unrelated files. And what we're looking at here is these lines of best fit that are increasing, they're moving further apart. So it does seem like it's accuracy that's driving this interference. The size of the markers here are the number of participants going into that data point. And as you can see, there's a lot more data at the sort of far end of the graph, because a lot of those participants were accurate right from the start. And here we did find a significant interaction between accuracy and foil type. So it's suggesting that this interference gets bigger as accuracy increases. But if we think about this, right, some participants have data points that are sort of across the accuracy range, whereas some participants, all their data points are in that really high accurate part of it. So it seems like there might be different things going on in terms of participants who are learning, and then what about participants who learn them very quickly and then are consolidating? You know, do they continue to have their interference increase, or does interference stabilize once you've learned them and then you're continuing to practice and continuing to practice? Or does it even decrease at that point? So to have a look at this, we looked separately at our kind of really slow, really fast learners and then our slower learners. So we took the top quartile of learners and the bottom quartile of learners, and we looked at the interference effect that each group has. So our kind of slower learners, you can see that interference is gradually increasing as they become more accurate. But the interesting thing is our kind of fast learners here, and what we're seeing is it increases and then it stabilizes. But there's no evidence that it's decreasing at all. So it's not the case that the more you practice and the more you practice, you manage to overcome that interference. It seems like it's a consistent feature of your learning and retrieval. You can't get rid of that interference. Okay, so conclusions from that study. So it seems to suggest that interference develops gradually as we're learning multiplication facts. It increases as the accuracy increases during the early stages of learning. And then they've got some evidence from those exploratory analyses that it then stabilizes. But we found no evidence of a decline. And actually, if you go back and read our grant proposal at the beginning, we were predicting it might then decline later, that as you consolidate and keep going over your facts, that it declines, but we found no evidence for that at all. But we did see this really large variability of learning, especially in the early stages. Okay, so that was the first study. So the next question is, well, what is involved in resolving this interference? We've shown it's a consistent feature of multiplication fact learning. And the assumption has always been that it's inhibitory control that we need, because that seems like the kind of role we would give to inhibitory control. But there isn't a lot of good evidence for that. There's this correlational evidence that I mentioned earlier, but that's not very satisfactory. So, a correlation can come around for any number of reasons. But you also might be aware that, there's increasing recognition of some of that issues around using inhibition type tasks, especially those difference scores as individual differences measures. And so that's kind of just looking for associations here might not be ideal. So really what is some experimental evidence? And so to investigate this, we borrowed an approach from the inhibition literature. So you'll all be very familiar with street tasks as this kind of very established way to measure inhibitory control, where a number streak is something that in the mathematical cognition we use quite a lot, obviously. You see two numbers, you're asked to pick the bigger numerically. And on some trials, the bigger numerically is also the bigger physically, and on other trials, the bigger numerically is the smaller physically. Those would be your incongruent trials, and we very, commonly see very reliable effects that higher performance with the congruent trials. We can do it with numbers, we can also do it with other kinds of stimuli, like pick the bigger animal, but pick which one is bigger in real life, ignoring the size on the screen, and you get those same kinds of inhibitory inhibition effects. And it feels a bit like our number fact composition task is acting a bit like that kind of inhibition task. So this time we don't have the stimuli differing, but it's about whether it's related or unrelated. So on some trials you're having to inhibit or ignore that related foil, and on other trials you're not having to. We see this difference between these related and unrelated trial types. But we'd really like to see if we can demonstrate that it does definitely involve inhibitory control. And the second question, which I'm not going to get into, I put scare quotes around my domain general and domain specific just because they're quite problematic terms, but the idea of how close to your number stimuli does that kind of inhibition have to be. So the other thing about inhibition tasks, and particularly on a street task, is that your performance doesn't only depend on the congruency of the existing trial you're doing, but also the previous trial. So this is the conflict adaptation effect, or the Breton effect, where if you look at the performance based on the current trial and the previous trial, for congruent trials, you're better if the trial before was also congruent, but for incongruent trials, you're better, is that graph the right one? Yeah, you're better if the previous trial was incongruent as well. So if you do an incongruent trial and you've just done an incongruent trial, you're likely to be better than if you had a congruent and then. Yeah, so I just said that. So what we were thinking is, well, if we interleave trials of a street task with our multiplication fact task, then do we see this kind of conflict adaptation effect? Because if we do, then that suggests that both types of trials are drawing on inhibitory control. And if we do that as well, does the type of street task matter? Let's try and get at this kind of domain generality aspect a little bit. So this is what we did. We did this as a pre-registered study with 450 adults online. We recruited via Prolific. This was a COVID twist, right? Because we got the grant just as COVID started, and we were going to do it in person, but we did it online. We did lots and lots of large-scale pilot studies beforehand to really establish that we can detect the effects online, and we replicated lots of in-lab data first before running this. And we had two different kind of between subject conditions. So everybody did this interleaving. But for some participants, they interleaved a number street with the multiplication task, and other participants interleaved the animal street with the multiplication task. And if you can see here, you're seeing like a street task, and then you have a chance to respond, and then you're seeing a multiplication task and a chance to respond, back to the street task, etc. So we're doing this. They did a lot of it, so they did 8 blocks of 64 trials. We know these effects are going to be small if they're there, so that's why big samples and lots of trials to try, especially because we're online, trying to detect those effects. And essentially what we're looking for here is to see if we get a significant interaction between the current trial congruency and the previous trial congruency. So that would show us our conflict adaptation effect. And then we want to see whether that two-way interaction also interacts with the type of street task. So if it's the case that actually you need to be doing a number street to have that kind of dependency across the different tasks, then we'd see that as a three-way interaction. Okay, so what did we find? Is there any evidence of a conflict adaptation effect? Yes, there is, which is exciting. Probably wouldn't be presenting it if there wasn't, but don't. So let me talk you through this graph. So what we've got here is accuracy on the left side and response time on the right side. The lines, the solid lines, are your current trial congruency. So that's congruent on the current trial. And here at the bottom, we've got the previous trial congruency. And essentially, we've got that thing of most clearly with the accuracy of the lines kind of approaching towards each other. And actually, if you look at the kind of post hoc on accuracy, we see the effect both on congruent and incongruent trial performance. But for reaction time, the interaction is driven just by the congruent trials and not by the incongruent trials. But yes, we did find a two-way interaction between previous and current congruency, both for accuracy and reaction time. And the next question, so does the type of, did we find a difference between our two participant groups in terms of the number street and the animal street? And here, no, we didn't. So there was no three-way interaction with streak condition, either for accuracy or for reaction time. So we're seeing the same pattern in the animal streak group and the number streak group. And we did all sorts of things because you don't want to rely on a null effect. So we looked at Bayes analysis, we did equivalence tests, we did as much as we could to persuade ourselves that this was a null effect that we could believe in, and we do. Okay, so that was our kind of pre-registered analyses. What we're in that analysis, we're collapsing across the two different types of tasks. So that's showing that we've got some dependency between the two interleaved tasks, but it doesn't tell us whether it's as strong in each direction. So is our streak task impacting the multiplication task to the same extent as vice versa? So we also did some exploratory results where we wanted to see whether we could see this transfer happening in both directions. So here we included the task as an additional factor. So again, we're looking for that two-way interaction to show evidence of the conflict adaptation effect. And this time, the three-way interaction shows you whether that interacts with task or not. And we've collapsed across our streak conditions here. So this is the graph. This time, this is both panels are accuracy, the same kind of graph, but on the left-hand side, that's the streak where the current trial is streak, and here is where the current trial is the multiplication. So you can see you've got a big accuracy difference here anyway. You'd expect people to be better on the streak tasks than the multiplication. And what we found for accuracy was, yes, we see it going in both directions. So there's a significant two-way interaction between the current trial congruency and the previous trial congruency, and this doesn't interact with the type of task. For reaction time, we've got even bigger reaction time differences between the two tasks. And you'll see here, particularly, there's no evidence for an interaction here. Those lines are parallel. So for reaction time, we had both a significant two-way and the three-way interaction with task. So what that means is that we're seeing on reaction time transfer from the streak to the multiplication task, but we don't see the transfer back in the other direction. So it goes in both directions when we look at accuracy, but just from streak to multiplication in terms of reaction time. And I think that, that makes sense. That's not a surprise that actually you would expect the streak task to sort of generate more kind of, require more inhibitory control than the multiplication factor. Okay. Yes, so that's the end of study 2. Yes, so what we've shown in study 2 is that I think that this is experimental evidence that retrieving multiplication facts, or at least choosing between the multiplication facts and verifying against a FOIL, does require inhibitory control, because we're seeing this evidence of the conflict adaptation effect. We found that it doesn't seem to depend on the similarity of the information being processed. So in terms of this kind of ongoing debate about how domain general inhibition really is, at least here, we found that you don't find that happening any stronger for a number streak than for an animal streak. And it's quite nice to have this kind of paradigm and to be able to show experimental evidence for the involvement of inhibitory control. So we're not just reliant on correlational evidence here. And it really supports the kind of models of multiplication fact retrieval that incorporate these kinds of interference mechanisms. And actually, I'm really excited about this approach more generally. So there's lots of areas of mathematical cognition where people seem to, suggest that there's an involvement of inhibitory control, things like looking at fractions, things like looking at word problems. And so this gives us kind of maybe a paradigm that we can start to get experimental evidence for those as well. Okay, so moving on to the last study. So the last study mostly focuses on these two questions around the type of practice, but also does tell us again something about the development of interference. And this is where we move to get away from adults, get away from the lab, and to look and see what can we see about this process of interference and learning multiplication facts with children. So I've shown you in the previous two studies that interference develops throughout fact learning, and it seems to involve inhibitory control to resolve. And so what we're interested in is, well, is there any way of changing that? So in our learning study with adults, they had to learn them the way that we showed them. So they had to just see them and retrieve the answer, produce the answer, and get feedback on that. But it's possible that if we vary the type of practice, we might vary that development of interference, or we might be able to use that interference. So it might be that different kinds of practice could reduce the impact of interference, or other types, increase the interference. But also it's possible that we could, could we build on, knowing that that interference is there and it's a feature of the learning process, can we actually build on it to help children learn? And also, I'm very interested in this interference as not being a bad thing, but as potentially being a really powerful thing, and getting into kind of multiplicative reasoning, because the interference is there because of the structure of multiplication. And so can we actually use that in some way? So we started the process of understanding this with a classroom intervention study, where we had 4 different variations of tablet-based training, and to look at the impact of that, both on children's learning and on interference. Okay, so this was with 222 year 3 children, so age 7 to 8, across Nottingham, 5 different Nottinghamshire primary schools. I'll tell you about the pre and post test measures first, and then I'll tell you about the intervention. So first of all, as our sort of measure of their knowledge of multiplication facts, they had a paper and pencil task where they had 5 minutes to answer as many items as they could. We also developed this kind of multiplicative reasoning, kind of applied multiplication task, where sorry, you can't really see the items here, but there are a range of word problems. They're more complex multiplication problems. Some of the problems ask children to draw a representation of a fact. So I can't see, I think that says 4 times 8 equals 32. And it's like, draw this 2 different ways. Show me 2 ways of representing 4 times 38. And they had some sort of grid problems that were just directly drawing on their multiplication fact knowledge. And that problem is one where they're asked about a sequence, to sort of imagine a sequence carrying on, and to see if a certain number is in there, and to give some reasoning. So they're all drawing on the kinds of items that children will see in their SATs, for example, the kind of items that they used to working on in class. And we made sure that some of the facts that we were training them were also in this kind of multiplication task, so we can see if they're able to apply them and understand them. We gave them, again, the number fact competition task here, obviously a single digit version of it here, and just the same as the adults one. And then we also gave them a pre-test only. They completed a maths anxiety measure. So this was adapted from Tom Hunt's work, and they had a sequence of questions about sort of when I see a lot of numbers, I feel. When I have to explain a maths problem to other children, I feel. And the pictures, Tom's been doing lots of work, because a lot of the things that are maths anxiety measures for children actually become just negative or positive. So you have a smiley face or a sad face. That's not really getting at anxiety per se. So he's worked on these images that they've developed with teachers and children, where you either feel okay, or you feel a little bit sad, or you feel quite sad. So it's definitely the amount of anxiety. It's not getting at enjoyment, because that's not what we're trying to isolate anxiety. Okay, so the intervention. So it was, the study itself lasted 4 weeks. We had a kind of pre-test week and a post-test week, and then the intervention itself went across 2 weeks. And it was 6 10-minute computer-based sessions. So children each had their own tablets. And we had 4 different conditions. And the factors that we manipulated here were the amount of time pressure children were under, and the way that they entered their answer. So these are 2 of the conditions. So these are both the conditions where children have to input their answer. Looks very like Times Tables Rock Stars, if you've ever seen that. But what we differed was, in the time pressure condition, this is a little bar where the parrot goes down and hits the bomb, and then it explodes, where your time's up. And they were given lots of try and answer as many as you can as quickly. They were given this pressure to try and do as many as you can. Whereas in the self-paced version, they were just told to, you know, try and answer as accurately as you can, and there was no overt time pressure. They weren't reminded how many they've done at the end of each little block or each little session. And then the other thing that we manipulated was how they entered their answer. So rather than having to produce it in this condition, they selected from multiple choice. And obviously in here, we've got those interfering answers as well. So perhaps using that interference can help children learn by kind of making them face up to it. And then we had 3 levels of challenge. So obviously, if you take a just class of year 3 children, they're all going to be at very different levels where they are. So based on our pre-test measure, we allocated children to different levels of training. So they were either working on items from 3 and 4 tables, or the 4, 6 and 8, or the 6, 7 and 9. And in between the facts that they were learning, there were lots that we felt they should know based on where they were. So there was a lot of reinforcement, so they would have found some of them quite easy. In terms of the procedure, everything was administered whole class, both the pre-test, post-test and the intervention. And as I said, we did the paper and pencil pre-test. We then scored that very quickly, assigned children to a level for their intervention, but also for the number fact competition task, because you're only going to pick up interference if you're assessing children at the level that they're kind of at or around about where they were. Okay, so pre-registered results. So first of all, what was the impact of the training condition on their fact recall, so that paper and pencil measure? Well, we found they learned stuff, they got better, which was great, but there was no impact of the different training conditions. So it might look like a little bit, but that first condition is just one participant bringing the mean down. There was no significant difference. If we look at the different types of level, we didn't pre-register this as a separate analysis, but if we look, we see that it's the children at level 2 that seem to be making the most improvement. And this would make sense that you need to catch children at the right time for this kind of development. Secondly, what about the impact of the training on the applied multiplication task? So here we did find a just significant effect of time. There's a just about detectable improvement, but again, there's no difference across the different training conditions. And I think, you know, that's a really disappointing level of improvement. So children are learning facts, but they're not, at least straight away, perhaps it takes more time, they're not able to do better on that kind of applied task. And then finally, what about interference? Do we see that interference changes over training? So if we compare pre-test and post-test on that interference task. So here, we haven't got training condition included. This is just looking across all different training conditions. We found that there was a significant effect of time and foil type. So we are finding that interference effect again, but there was no interaction. So like our first study, we found no change in interference across this period of learning. And if we add training condition, it doesn't improve the fit of the model. Have I got 2 more minutes? Can I just finish with this bit? Sorry, I'm going to go very slightly over. Okay, this is exciting. So, did maths anxiety relate to learning? So, some of you will be aware that this is a very kind of popular topic that a lot of people say there is a relationship, and in fact, lots of people claim that timed practice causes maths anxiety. We can't answer that question, but there's often claimed that this relationship. So we had a look at this by just splitting those training conditions into the time pressure versus the no time pressure conditions. And we found that, and we were predicting change in multiplication fact recall, so learning, by maths anxiety. And we found that there was a significant interaction. So for children who were in the no time pressure condition, there was no relationship between their maths anxiety and their learning. But for children in the time pressure condition, there was this negative correlation between maths anxiety and learning. So there is a bit of evidence here that if your child is maths anxious, maybe take the overt time pressure off. And it's important to say that was overt time pressure. Actually, what they were doing was very, very similar. It's just one of them had this visual reminder, your time's running out, you must do more, and the other didn't. So I think that's quite a simple thing to adjust when we're looking at the way that children practice. Okay, I'm going to skip through that and just do my conclusions, and I can answer that again. So we found that you can get better at times tables by practicing the times tables. We found that training didn't impact the level of learning or the interference, but there is some evidence for this impact of time pressure. And the last thing I was going to say is that we found that although children got better at the times tables recall, they didn't get better at the multiple reasoning task. And actually, we've got lots of examples of children who got full marks on their times tables test, and then they made all sorts of errors. They couldn't use the facts they knew when they were actually doing these kind of more applied problems. So that's my summary implications. So I think it's really important to remember that multiplication fact knowledge is not just about learning a list of facts, and a lot of the discussions that you see in educational circles seems to think about this as being just learning a sequence of facts, but this interference is this really inevitable consequence of the way that the facts are stored. And this is something that we're working with educators to kind of try and get that message out around the importance of interference, and how important it is to offer a range of types of practice. Okay, I'll stop there. Oh, can I just say one thing? We're going to have some really lovely teacher resources in about 2 weeks on our website. So if you are interested, then please go and go and look at that. Great.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I always just never quite get the time.
No, we've got time for questions. So any questions from the audience? And I think Anne, afterwards, Ilse first, because we've been given the brief to ask earlier career scientists first. There you go.
Thank you so much. I really agree that the experimental setup you put there is getting to something that I think
it's really exciting, isn't it? Yeah,
that's really exciting. I have a very broad question. I don't know if you know anything about it. I'm thinking, what's the potential interaction there between inhibition and metacognition and this type of thing? Because if they don't know that they're making a mistake, then maybe they're not going to use interference that much. And if they're less sure, maybe something to do with maths anxiety, so if you're more maths anxious, maybe less sure and then need more, or more interrupted by interference, or just.
Yeah, so I don't know anything about metacognition and the interference element itself. I mean, obviously you know about the kind of more general evidence about metacognition and fact learning and other parts of maths. I think children did know how they were doing, but I don't think they would have recognised that, because they got the correct answer given to them if they weren't correct. But I don't think they would have realised the role of the interference. I mean, I think that's one thing that's quite interesting to think about, is whether actually drawing children's attention to it could be helpful. And so, sometimes you might have two answers that feel like they both could be right, and sort of getting them to recognise that interference and think about how to pick the right one might be useful. But I don't know, it's just speculation.
Yeah, I have very, very interesting. I had two slightly related questions. One is the relationship to inhibitory control is very interesting. To what extent do you think you'd find a relationship to working memory, given there are lots of studies which suggest that working memory and
So, all right, I'll answer that one first. So, in the adult learning study, we sneaked in a working memory measure. We only had 50 participants, so it wasn't pre-registered because that's not a big enough sample to look at a correlation. But we thought, since we're doing this, we might as well pop one in. Didn't find a correlation between that kind of initial learning. So, I mean, it feels like working memory's got to be involved somehow, but it's not in a very simple level that you learn quicker if you've got working memory.
The other question, the other question is we've been looking at very much the relationship to factual learning and also to applications. But I was wondering whether you think you'd get similar results for procedural learning, or learning multiplication or short multiplication techniques.
Yes, so We haven't done that, we haven't looked at that. So one thing that I think is really important, this is something I talk a lot to teachers about, is that process of building that associative network. You can get there through doing it procedurally. So you can build that network with never doing any rote learning, any rote memorization or flashcards, because what we know is that anything that gets you to associate those numbers with their product can help you build that network. So that could be doing it with materials, it could be doing it through like a counting procedure, it could be doing it through a derived fact procedure. So I think it does, I'm interested as to whether the process you do to build that network has any impact. It could be that actually it doesn't matter whether you get there through memorization or through procedural methods, you're building the same network. But it could be that it has a different impact, and I think we don't know. I mean, I think the advantage of that is that then if you can't recall it, you've got a backup strategy. Whereas if you just do rote memorization and you can't recall it, you've got nothing.
It's very good.
Go for it. No, Joe first. Joe first, and then
just with my ex-practitioner hat on, always can't help it. I was wondering, did you measure anything with a comparison group like one of the other classes that didn't do that? Or are you going to look at those results that they get in that year 4 test?
Yeah.
Any kind of
So no, so this wasn't an attempt. This was an attempt to answer a very specific theoretical question. So the app is actually a CyclePy Pro experiment. It's not an app that we can share or put out there with anything. It was designed to answer these questions. So we decided not to have a control group because we're actually not trying to say this practice is better than nothing. We're actually trying to compare those conditions.
I get that. I just wonder out of interest whether those children, just having done that and exercise that kind of thing, it made them progress better than their peers.
Yeah, it would have been lovely to know, but we don't know how that's going.
thank you. Sorry.
I was curious about the relationship you showed us between mathematics anxiety and performance or time conditioning. Is that a specific relationship to maths anxiety? Is that a general anxious people don't do well?
Yeah. So here we were just looking at maths anxiety, but other work that has pulled that apart, and you can clearly isolate maths anxiety that's not explained by general anxiety or test anxiety or anything like that. So there is definitely a separate component that is specific to maths, and that you can see that specifically relating to maths outcomes. But we didn't look at that.
Can I ask one more question? I know you go back to GCSE revision. Sorry, Camilla's son is taking GCSEs, so just driving back and forth. How much do you think, if at all, in fact, the learning that one observes in this age group builds upon earlier foundational skills? And by that I mean that those numbers are represented in semantic networks for other reasons. For example, place value, space on a number line. I mean, and maybe those representations don't matter as much, but do they?
So the models and theories I talked about will mostly focus on multiplication, but actually we see addition and multiplication interfering with each other. So as well as the other multiplication facts, interfering, you get interference from, 3 times 5 equals 8 is a common kind of error because you're mixing up those. So it definitely suggests that these are not isolated and that they're integrated. And we haven't looked at kind of spatial representations. We did do a whole load of analysis on the inhibition study, looking at the size of the number and how that might have an impact, because left and right and small and large and all that kind of stuff. And it didn't explain anything that wasn't involved.
Thank you. Well, if Camilla is going to have to run off, but please get in touch with her or with me, with her via me. Thank you so much for coming in. So thank you so much.